Welcome to the Irish Revolution. So, in July 1919, we talked about the creation of the Squad, the famous execution squad set up by Michael Collins to wage an intelligence war against the British state. This month we have a cracker of an episode coming up. We're going to talk about how the Irish Volunteers became the Irish Republican Army, and I'm going to outline the three military phases of the War of Independence, about the oath of allegiance to the Dáil, and also a quick look at the state of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police, in August 1919. So let's start with the organisation of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. How did the IRA wage war against the British state? On August 9th, a week-long training camp was set up in Glandore, County Cork for 35 Battalion and Company officers of the Cork No. 3 Brigade. It was led by Dick McKee, the Director of Training for General Headquarters and the OC of the Dublin Brigade. Also present from GHQ were Gerard O'Sullivan, Adjutant General, Leo Henderson, Assistant Director of Communications, and Tom McMahon, Assistant Director of Engineering. The training camp was raided on the 13th in a joint operation by the RAC and the British Army. The British arrested 4 men, including Gerard O'Sullivan, and left. Remarkably, the training camp continued after this. On August 16th, there was a reorganisation of the West Cork No. 3 Brigade. A meeting was held in Carra, presided over by Michael Collins. Ted O'Sullivan became the Vice Commandant, replacing Sean Hayes. Liam Deasy became Brigade Adjutant, and Pat Hart becomes Quartermaster. This was a very good IRA unit that would go on to cause a lot of bother. I'm just getting these lads' name out there because we're going to hear more from them in the future. Organising the volunteers, as they were still known at this point, was far from being an easy task. The first steps took place in 1918 when the brigade areas were established by General Headquarters. Most counties accepted the scheme, with some rumblings of discontent, but in some counties local realities were insurmountable. Clare had to have 3 brigades solely because 3 prominent local families were not prepared to merge together. In case you're interested, those 3 families were the Brennans, the Barretts and the O'Donnells. Originally, the Volunteers General Headquarters had some vague idea that the secretive Irish Republican Brotherhood would enable a kind of central control to emerge, but in the end this proved nigh impossible. The IRB was still influential in some areas, and Michael Collins as leader of the IRB certainly would have enjoyed a kind of extra prestige from the role and some power, but the IRB didn't extend everywhere, and indeed many Republicans were suspicious of it. Instead of General Headquarters effecting control from the centre through a secret society, their influence would prove to be much more abstract. They would enable and encourage the process of military professionalisation, which was beginning to take root among the most active units, as we discussed earlier. The guerrilla conflict, which was just finding its feet at this early stage, would eventually develop a logic and momentum of its own. There were 3 broad phases here. All credit goes to Charles Townshend and his wonderful book Political Violence in Ireland, which I recommend that you all buy and read. So the first phase was a long period of low-level operations. The boycott of the RAC, isolated ambushes against individual policemen, raids for arms, etc. This process began in 1918 and will continue until the winter of 1919-20. The result of these activities was to isolate and drive in the outposts of the RAC, the police. The smaller outposts will become unmanageable and untenable. The police were then concentrated in larger, more defensible barracks of between 8 to 12 men each. This process began around now in the autumn of 1919. The police, whose morale had cratered with the RAC boycott, was now in a situation where they were physically isolated as well. The second phase was a consequence of the success of the first phase. Having hounded the police out of much of the countryside, the volunteers were forced to develop ways to attack the large police posts. These were difficult targets, and few units were able to successfully take out a barracks. Many made do with isolated sniping late at night and causing a general nuisance. The more active units started a series of full-scale attacks in January 1920, such as in Carrigtwohill and later in May in Kilmallock, County Limerick, where an all-night battle took place. 16 barracks were destroyed and 29 damaged in the first 6 months of 1920. In addition, 400 smaller posts were burnt as the authorities retreated and consolidated their power. By also intimidating jurors in the British legal system was paralysed by the summer of 1920 and was mostly replaced by an alternative system of Republican Dáil Courts, of which I made an episode. As a result of these attacks and the threat on the justice system, the British responded with a formal policy of reprisal and took steps towards military rule, thus exacerbating the conflict. The third phase of the conflict was the British intensification of the war in Ireland with the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act. As the government hunted the isolated gunmen who had caused such disarray in the countryside, volunteers were forced to abandon their homes and day jobs and go permanently on the run, becoming full-time guerrilla fighters. Thus was born in autumn 1920 the famous flying columns, or active service units according to General Headquarters. These were unplanned and totally spontaneous. By the winter of 1920-21, every brigade worth talking about had one, and there were several dozen flying columns active in the country. These columns then went on to perform ambushes which, although had been attempted on a very small scale before, now had become much more sophisticated. And that more or less is the military outline of the War of Independence from the perspective of the Irish Volunteers General Headquarters. And now a look at the RAC. 2 policemen were shot in an ambush near Innistimon, County Clare. I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. Sergeant John Reardon and Constable Michael Murphy were shot by local volunteers. Reardon managed to scribble in his prayer book before he died that they were shot by, quote, assassins, unquote. Murphy, just 20 years old, was a fresh recruit and son of a police pensioner. I wanted to take a bit of time today to have a look at the RAC. Why would somebody join the RAC and what kind of position was it? The example of Constable Murphy is indicative in that he was the son of a policeman. Being in the RAC was, at least until this point, widely considered to be a respectable and stable profession. I sincerely doubt if many of the policemen were political in any sense, but undoubtedly, like most of their compatriots, it would have been Irish nationalists in the sense that they would have supported the Irish Parliamentary Party up until very recent years. That said, police in Ireland at this time were not permitted to vote in parliamentary elections, and it was not well seen to have political opinions, at least in public. The escalation of conflict following the Easter Rising and the early period of the Irish War of Independence probably would have shocked many of them, as it would have shocked the general public. The RAC were not, however, a normal police force because they had a political role and carried rifles with them on their duties. They were in fact more of a gendarmerie, which is a kind of military police. The Morning Post wrote this in 1920, quote, a semi-military force, armed and drilled and concentrated in those little barrack forts that are the blockhouses of imperial rule in Ireland, unquote. Many of the rank and file peelers, as they were known, disliked the rifle that they carried, feeling that they were a barrier to forming relationships with normal people. But their superiors were never prepared to consider disarming them, or at least arming them more lightly, as it would have been the case in Britain. Also in this month, the Chief Secretary introduced a bill in Westminster to improve the pay and conditions of the RAC, which will be passed later in the year in an attempt to improve morale and recruitment into the RAC, which had suffered greatly from the IRA campaign and the public boycott of them. And finally today, a few words on the 5th session of the Revolutionary Parliament Dáil Éireann. On August 20th, a motion was passed by the Dáil that an oath of allegiance to the Republic should be taken by all Dáil deputies, volunteers and officials. The oath stated, I will support and defend the Irish Republic and the government of the Irish Republic, which is Dáil Éireann, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It was proposed by Cal Brua and seconded by Terence MacSwiney. The motion was strongly supported by Arthur Griffiths, who said that the army and the government could not be under a separate authority. The volunteers did take the oath, with many reservations, but it would be to all practical purposes an independent and separate organisation. Formal responsibility for IRA actions were only taken by the Dáil in spring 1921. Arthur Griffiths, for example, a key figure in the revolutionary government, seemed to be completely unaware of IRA activities and plans, and among the fighting men there was a general contempt for political figures. But despite all this, an important moral principle had been established with the oath. From this point on, Irish volunteers were becoming known as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Finally, a look at a few biographies here, starting with Terence MacSwiney, who was a playwright and intellectual. He was elected the Lord Mayor of Cork in 1920. He was later arrested on charges of sedition and sent to Brixton Prison. He died there after spending 74 days on hunger strike. His hunger strike fixed world attention on the Irish question, and MacSwiney was considered one of the leading martyrs of the struggle. Don't worry, his hunger strike will get a lot more attention when we start in the 1920 episodes next year. And Liam Deasy was an adjutant in the 3rd Cork Brigade. He served under arguably the most famous IRA leader of the war, Tom Barry. He took part in some of that brigade's most famous ambushes of the war, but did not take part in the Kilmichael ambush, which wiped out a company of Auxiliaries. His brother, Pat, died in that ambush. Deasy opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty and fought on the anti-treaty side during the Civil War. It was his unit that ambushed and killed Michael Collins at Ballynabla. Although DC wasn't actually present at the ambush, he was at the pub. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Talk to you soon. Good luck now. Bye. Bye bye.